Hello everybody and welcome to another Stellaris Explained episode where we're going to go over ship design this time. Since we've gone over weapons, which is the most complex part of ship design, we can now kind of talk about the rest of it and how those weapons would fit into a good system. Corvettes, as I mentioned before, have a high evasion just out of their base evasion. So essentially, when you're using them, you kind of want to stack on that, but you don't exactly have to. If you are trying to min-max, really what you want to do is just take the cheapest weapon system that you have, stack it up 3 times, give it whatever the cheapest power system you can, and then send it on its way. It's a strong strategy used in a lot of multiplayer games these days. Not exactly fun, but if you're trying to min-max, building as many Corvettes as you can, going way over your naval cap, because it's dirt cheap still anyways, and you can just outproduce the energy and mineral credit modifiers, that is the best way to go. But if you want to have fun with the game and mess around with, the different mechanics and just enjoy yourself, there are a few different ways you want to use Corvettes. The most standard way is you just want it to be a small gunboat that's going to tank as much damage as possible while pretty much just distracting your enemy. That's what Corvettes are great at. And usually I like to use Gauss cannons to do that. You can also do things like put stormfires on them. The plasma throwers also can be very useful at times, depending on what enemy you're using or you're up against. But more or less, I tend to stick with Gauss cannons on my Corvettes. Obviously, FTL choice is going to be depending on what technologies you have. For your combat computers, the precognitive interface is obviously the best. You're going to get another 11% chance to evade. That's amazing. Depending on how much you want to spend on your Corvettes, depending on how much you're going to be throwing them away, you may or may not be adding these computer systems. I absolutely recommend spending the credits to put in at least thrusters, though. And as for radar systems, I guess, the sensors don't necessarily have to be upgraded, but if you plan on actually doing damage with your Corvettes, you probably want to do that. So generally, I just upgrade these as far as I can. I put in whatever's nicest, and I'll fill this up with jump drives, or not jump drives, Gauss cannons here. And then, honestly, there's no point in ever putting armor on these things. More than likely, your Corvettes are going to die very quick, horrible deaths. So really what I like to do is I like to put on some afterburners so that they can get into engagement range faster, and then maybe put on some shields if I can float it. Right now it looks like I have enough energy. I can put in a little bit of shielding here. But yeah, I mean, realistically, you're expecting these guys to die horrible deaths all the time, so you don't really want to fill them up with armor. They're going to take a few hits at most in the first place. Putting armor on them might give you one more hit, and it's not really worth it. They're gonna die no matter what. And as a result, you just kind of outfit them that way. You try and make them as cheap as possible, but still effective. Next up we have destroyers, and destroyers are built one of 2 ways in my fleets. It really depends on the state of the game. Early on, I kind of use them as a pseudo cruiser, where I will fit them with large and medium slot weapons and try to have them do as much damage as possible. Usually, with whatever kinetic weaponry I have. Maybe I'll throw in something funny, like maybe I'll have Disruptors 1 or something like that I can use in my medium slots. You have access to crazy missiles like this, which is unlikely in the destroyer phase. You could try those out. Those would probably be a good way to go with that. Destroyers don't have a ton of evasion at their base. Let's remove all these. So base destroyer evasion, when I remove the combat computer, is only 25%. When you give it all its modifiers, it goes up to 43. Not nearly as much as the Corvettes, so you don't really want to worry about that. These guys are going to get hit a lot more often, and you're able to put on some shields to kind of mitigate that. But the hull points, again, are so low that it's not really worth using armor for the most part. So a lot of times early game, I'll put in, whatever large slot I have. Maybe sometimes I'll have a little bit of kinetic batteries or whatever, some Gauss cannons. And then down here, I kind of just try and fill in as many shields as I can. I will usually throw on a shield capacitor if I can, and then put in whatever power requirements I have. Looks like I can probably swap something like that. Yeah, something like that. That looks like a good early game destroyer. Obviously, you're not going to have class 5 stuff, but you can replace it with class 4, class 3, whatever. you're just going to try and put in a few shields, bunch of energy, and some large weapons. When you get into the later game stuff and you start to have capital ships, you're going to want to move over, or at least I usually move over to point defense. And this is so that I can outfit my larger ships with nothing but large weaponry. They don't have to worry about defending themselves. All I'm going to do is put either point defense, or if I get to the point where I have flak systems, I'll pick whichever has the most medium slots, and I will fill up flak batteries everywhere that I can. There's always a couple extra slots. You can mess around, you know, put in some Gauss cannons or auto cannons. And yeah, I mean, the bottom is going to be about the same. You don't have the hull points for armor to really matter, so you just put in shields where you can. And it tends to work out. This is more of a combined arms approach, obviously, because you're using the destroyers simply to protect your larger capital ships. But yeah, once you get into that phase of the game, it's very important. And having high tracking with a bunch of flak artillery is a great way to shoot down all the missiles, as well as do damage once the destroyers get in there because they have mixed behavior. So yeah, that's destroyers. Next up we have cruisers, and cruisers are your first capital ships. These ships are big and heavy and they have no evasion, so this is kind of the point where you don't really care about evasion. It's nice to have extra engines and, you know, combat modules so that you can get a little bit in there, but realistically you're not going to be dodging any shots with these ships. Cruisers also are able to load a ton of torpedoes, so if you're up against an empire that doesn't have the ability to fight back against missiles, that's a great way to go, especially if you have devastating torpedoes, such as the, is it the neutrons? Yeah, the neutron torpedoes here, 200% shield damage, that's pretty amazing. And then these ones just ignore shields altogether. Basically, if you can, use them, but a lot of times you can't. You also get the option to start fitting hangars, and with hangars you can, you know, use a little bit of extra point defense or whatnot. You also have the point defense slots. But I don't recommend this at all. This is what your destroyer should be doing. You shouldn't be using these cores with this ship. Generally, what I recommend is fit some large slot stuff. You can only fit a medium in the back, but you can get 2 large slots, 2 medium slots, and that's pretty great. You're going to want the best sensors that you can fit because you want as much tracking as possible. Those large weapons aren't going to track very well on their own. And I mean, if you have something like kinetic artillery, that's a great way to go. If you have whirlwind missiles or swarmer missiles, you know, that's a fair choice. You could try using those. They're not particularly great. I would recommend over that some phase disruptors or plasma cannons, something like that. Also, you can fit flak on here, and it's not a terrible decision. Flak on its own actually isn't that bad. It has pretty good tracking, pretty good accuracy, and it's got a decent range. It's just not ideal. I wouldn't recommend it. If you're gonna fit flak, try and do a destroyer, or yeah, because you can't fit mediums on the small boats, on the Corvettes, but you can fit flak on your destroyers, and that's probably a better choice. Your behavior is gonna be mixed, but if you fit them with long-range weapons, they're gonna at least try to stay in the back. It is Paradox AI, it's not perfect, but it will try. The other interesting thing about cruisers is that you now have the hull points to really think about armor. So if you fit up something like this, you put in some shield capacitors, so you know your shields are doing well. I'm looking at a little bit extra power, so I can think about maybe doing like something like this. It's a little much, but say I turn down my engines a little bit because, you know, it's whatever, there's no evasion anyways. Now I'm looking at something with some armor on there, which is going to help modify any hull point damage. Plus I got the shields that are going to regenerate daily, and, you know, I got a decent weapons platform. Finally, we have here our battleships, and as you can see, I kind of did a little bit of a loadout here. Battleships, as I've kind of explained before, are your big bad ships that want to kill all the other big bad ships, so you want to load them out that way. You're not going to have to deal with a lot of evasion, so having some sensors and large slot weapons should be fine. Obviously, the spinal mount bow is my preferred bow, mostly just because I can fit the focused arc emitter. If I don't have it, I may consider doing a couple large slots instead, but it's entirely situational. Most of the time, I just tried to fit the extra large with whatever extra large tech that I have. I don't waste my time with any afterburners or anything like that. These guys are always artillery behavior for every mode that they have, so they're gonna try to stand in the background and just fire. So you want to put long-range weapons when you can. These are my only real exception. Sometimes I will fit phase disruptors and plasma cannons on my battleships, simply because when you're fighting another battleship, you know, sometimes you need to punch through their armor, or sometimes you need to punch through their shields. Again, we have a lot of hull points, so armor is a viable strategy depending on what the enemy fleet makeup is. So sometimes you want to throw a couple in there, and then you want to obviously put in shields because you get better regen from shields than hull points, even with the generative tissue, which I think is pretty much garbage in most cases, with the exception of maybe scout fleets or something like that. And yeah, I mean, big weapons, long ranges is what you're kind of looking for. Once you have those, once you have those, you also want to, you know, get good sensors and get the best combat computers you can. And yeah, that's about it. Defense stations are a little different, and defense stations are something that I don't really use a lot of, but they can be entirely viable depending on what you're trying to do. There are kind of two different types of section. There are your defense platform and defense station sections, where you have the choice of these four sections. And then there are your fortress sections, which are kind of doubling up on what the standard defense sections are. Don't recommend hangars, more or less. I mean, look, hangars are awesome. They're super fun to play with, but if you're trying to get a good station, you probably don't want to use them. Medium slots are entirely viable because you may be coming up against a lot of Corvettes, high evasion kind of things, so you might not always want to load up on large slot weapons, but definitely useful. With the medium slots, you can do things like your whirlwind missiles, if you have them. That is a very good strategy because not only do they have a good range for their size, they also have that 200% evasion, so they're going to be able to hit things. And they have great tracking. That 70% tracking and 100% accuracy is really good, even if your missiles do disappear every time a ship is downed. There are no extra large slots on the defense stations, sadly. I mean, it would be cool to mount these things, but it's not something you get to do, so you just kind of don't. Putting some point defense or putting some flak, which is much better, is a good idea. And then, you know, you can kind of play around with it. If you want to put in hangars for some bombers and fighters, go for it, you know? It is what it is. These stations are not meant to last, even the fortresses. Like, expect them to die almost all the time. Really, the point of these defense stations is to get your modifiers. And these auras come from tech. They can be very useful depending on what you're trying to do. Mostly, I like the subspace snares because I like to trap a fleet once they enter a system. And then you can do something like your quantum destabilizer or your shield dampener if they're focusing on shields. And that really, really helps. Minefields are mediocre at best. They're not really that great. Capacitor fields, if you're using a lot of shields and you have an enemy that can't really fight them, is great. And the nanobot clouds are alright if you want to put a defense station, say, in your home system or something where you're docking up a lot, because then your fleets are going to repair faster once they're home. For armor and stuff, you have a ton of hull points, so armor is actually super viable if you want to load up on it. Shields are also very helpful when in combat, especially with things like your capacitor fields and your shield capacitors. You can get quite a bit of shield regen if you load up. So depending on what the enemy fleet has, you may or may not want to load up on shields. And then, you know, you have your sensors, which again, it's going to be tracking for your weapons. If you're expecting a big fleet of small things, you want to get some really great sensors. Otherwise, the small sensors would work fine. But more or less, it's not a huge cost to go up to the larger sensors, so I usually just put the larger sensors on there and call it a day. Something like this with a mixture of shields and armor is totally viable, and what I would suggest, really what you want to think about is which of these auras you're going to use. I wouldn't really recommend mines. I wouldn't really recommend... the others are situationally useful. I like the quantum destabilizer a lot. I like to trap with the subspace snares and then use the destabilizer to ruin the enemy's fire rate. And then I just bring my fleet in and clean up, you know? But again, shield dampeners and capacitor fields can be useful if you're looking at a large fleet or something like that. It just all depends. So yeah, I hope this was helpful to you guys. I really liked the reception of the last video. Seems like you all seem to enjoy it very well. And I definitely plan on continuing this. Probably in the future I'll start looking at diplomacy and wars and things like that. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.